Welcome to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. Today I'm speaking with Dan Sneider. Dan's a therapist and he helps men rebuild intimacy by learning to feel, communicate, connect more honestly in their relationships and a whole lot of other things which we're going to talk about. So welcome to you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Philip. I'm excited for our conversation today.
Great, good. And it's a really interesting topic as well that we've not really covered an awful lot. So you specialize in helping men understand, their emotions, how to build intimacy, especially where it might be lost. Perhaps you could start by talking about, perhaps your experience. What drew you into this work in the first place?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I love your podcast. I love the focus here because as a man myself, I just relish the opportunity to talk with other men and to work on this together, right? I don't have it all figured out. I'm not perfect. And so the more that I have a platform to talk with men and to work through, my own stuff about feelings, the better. And I want for all the men out there listening to know that they're normal, their struggles, whatever they may be around understanding their feelings, being able to communicate them, they make sense and they come from somewhere, and we want to work on that. We want to grow as people. And so for me and for my story, and probably a lot of people out there listening have some kind of connection to this too. Growing up in my household, I had a mom and a dad, and with my mom, I felt much more safe and able to be sad, to be upset, to express my feelings. She was very, very loving, very kind, very warm. But at the same time, was not able to protect me from what was going on with my dad in the household. And he would come home either very hot, angry, frustrated, criticizing people, name calling. Sometimes things were thrown in my house. Other times he would come home very cold, distant, and could go hours or sometimes days without, talking to anybody in the house. And so those were my models, right? And very much learned quickly that I had to protect myself, right? Other people weren't going to protect me. I needed to protect myself. And that meant that I withdrew a lot from tapping into my feelings that weren't safe to share. So anger became something that I could feel and I could express. I could lash out in different ways. And that did not serve me very well, but it was a way to get through that period of childhood.
So you shut down basically to protect yourself. So you thought you just numbed your emotions because that was your coping mechanism.
Nailed it. No, that's exactly it, Philip. That's exactly what I learned from that, and something I've been working to unlearn ever since. But that's some early experiences, and eventually that led to me being taken to a therapist as a teenager, and that's what ultimately started me on the path to doing the work that I do now, seeing that there was a different way.
And how did that kind of work for you, without going into any personal details? How did that help you as a teenager start to come to terms with the relationship that you had, not just with your father, but with your mother as well?
So it helped because there was now a space where an adult was safe to hear what was going on and could help me with it. He wasn't I saw a male therapist also, which was also very helpful to have a male role model that was, safe, could hold all the stuff that was going on for me. Didn't judge me, wasn't critical of my feelings or my experiences, and wasn't connected to my home life, right? To try to talk to my mom or my dad about any of this would have been really loaded because they were directly involved in it. And at the time that I started going to therapy, they went through a pretty ugly divorce, right? And so that was all happening during my teenage years too. And so my connection in therapy was really wonderful because it was a place separate from my peer group at school, which had its own things happening, separate from the chaos happening at home, and was a place just for me that was safe to be able to talk through the things that was going on and to get feedback, to get advice, and to learn that the better I could understand my feelings and communicate them, the better that I felt.
So once you reach teenage years and get a bit older, you know, you start to develop relationships, perhaps emotional, romantic, sexual relationships with other people. How did you, and I guess other men listening to this who can relate to this, what impact does that have, especially when you're really young, in terms of how you approach relationships? Because presumably what you've got to go by is not, the best kind of blueprint.
Mhm. Oh yeah, putting it mildly. Yeah, well, and you said something that was so spot on earlier, and I want to connect back to it. That idea of numbing, turning off your emotions. And I know that people listening can connect with that, because as men, that's, sadly a really common thing that we learn to do, is to turn those emotions off, push them down, push them away, and learn that there's only kind of certain ways we can express those safely. I mentioned anger. One way is anger, frustration. That's one way. And for me, you mentioned romantic relationships and sexual relationships, and porn and masturbation was a huge part of self-soothing for me and managing my emotions, right? That's a way that I can take care of my own feelings, whatever they are, not have to rely on other people. And so as I was getting into relationships with people, not having a great role model for, loving, connected relationships, I had a lot of dysfunction in my relationships, and that led into, later in my 20s, when I did get married and started having a family. I have two kids. That was a big problem in our relationship. Was I would feel frustrated, upset, disconnected, but my default setting was to withdraw, right? And I hear that from so many of the men that I work with, that they don't know how to talk about their feelings and to work through them, and it affects all parts of their relationship. And it affected my emotional connection with my wife, and it affected our sexual connection too, because I would withdraw into, like I said, porn or masturbation to soothe my feelings, and couldn't connect in a vulnerable, healthy way sexually, in the way that our relationship really needed.
So, I mean, that's, there are so many different topics here, but if you've got, men, maybe young men who are not as experienced or starting out in their relationship journey, if they're really exposed to pornography, that gives you a specific view of sex and intimacy. So what problems does that then actually cause when you're in a real relationship with a real, woman? What kind of, I guess that helps. That doesn't help that withdrawal, I guess, because it's not as you thought it was going to be. It's not as, as most porn is depicted.
Hmm. Yeah, well, and I know for midlife men, or there's still a broad age range there. And so whether we're talking about just a visual image, right? Like my porn early exposure was, magazines, still images. And then, later there's video, right? The internet becomes a thing. So across midlife, we may have had exposure, access to different kinds of pornography, but the connecting part that's harmful is that there's not a two-way real interaction. Even if you are like now with the internet, right? Like, or even, 20, 30 years ago, you could call someone, you could pay for an interaction, but it's not a true real life relationship where there's care flowing both ways. And so what one of the damaging things that you learn there is that I don't have to rely on my partner for these needs to be met. I can have this kind of secret, separate part of myself, and I'm closing off the relationship from being able to help me through whatever it is I'm feeling. And there may be a really deep emotional need that's unmet. It could just be stress from the day, right? Like it could be like we don't have to go super deep. It could be, I had a stressful day and I want to have sex. I want to physically connect. And for whatever reason, that feels like I'm not able to do that. Maybe we have young kids. Maybe my partner's stressed. Maybe there's other things that need to be done. And instead of going to my partner and sharing the stress from my day, connecting with them, working through it together, and building that closeness, if I take all that energy and put it into this fantasy world of porn and masturbation, then, my partner is left by themselves on the other side of the house. And there's a huge missing piece to our relationship that, as it turns out, and I've learned over the years through this work, like that's just the best part of the relationship when you really can be vulnerable and connect with a real person. The sex can be amazing, different than the disconnected, maybe like routine sex you were having before, but also you get to feel seen as a whole person. You don't have to hide this huge part of yourself.
And I guess it's quite addictive and it's a quick fix for a lot of men as opposed to addressing, a more mature relationship.
That is true. Yes, it goes around the issue, right? It can be a quick fix that causes long-term issues for sure.
What about shame? How does shame come into this? Do men feel, remorse, shame because they are, leading this not a double life, but they're perhaps not addressing issues in their relationship, issues with intimacy?
It certainly can. This is borrowed from Brene Brown, who's just like a wonderful writer, speaker. If anybody listening hasn't checked out any of Brene Brown's stuff, I highly recommend it. But the best way that I know that she has taught to think about shame is that feeling guilty about something is I did something wrong. Shame is I am wrong. I am bad. I am that embodied whole, badness. And when we feel shame, it can be so hard to talk about it, to do it a different way because we feel all the way through bad. So this can absolutely play out in relationships where I do work with couples and I work with men where there has been infidelity or there has been secret keeping or a really big betrayal. And that shame feeling can leave us stuck. Like we don't know what to do. We don't know how to make it better because this really big bad thing has happened. And so trying to move from shame into guilt is work that I know is truly important. Like, okay, we did something bad or we did many things bad, but there is a way to move forward from there. And truly in a partnership where we want to share our lives together, if we feel so ashamed of our actions or the amount that we're looking at porn or the type of porn we're looking at, or our shame that maybe we are not able to perform sexually with our partner in the way they want us to, or we can't be open about our feelings in the way that we want us to. Shame keeps us from making any forward progress. So we want to move from that shame feeling to maybe a small step forward. Doesn't have to be a giant leap. I'm all about making small forward steps of progress.
So why do you find relationships can change, in midlife for men, perhaps in their 40s, 50s? Maybe they've been with the same partner for 20, 30 years. What are some of the reasons that those, relationships can change?
Yeah, great question. And so across the lifespan, there's all sorts of physical and developmental changes happening. And particularly around midlife, for men and for women, there's changes that happen that are truly significant. And perhaps on your show, you've talked before about like hormonal changes that happen for men and testosterone changes. And that's been a really interesting kind of topic that's become more mainstream, like more open for men to talk about, that the changes that we're feeling are normal and there are ways that we can address them. And I'm really glad to hear that because for so long, right, men have either pushed those things down or explained them away. But that is a big change that happens in midlife. There's also a big cultural change that happens. When we're earlier in our lives, I know true for me, and I'm sure for people listening, in your 20s and 30s, there's so much pressure to prove yourself, to achieve, to compare yourself to others, to provide, right? And that pressure is so strong that there's not a lot of willingness to be vulnerable or to share struggles. And when we do get to midlife, and this has been such a welcome thing for me, where I feel so much less of that pressure moving into midlife that no, I don't have to prove myself in that way. And now in my relationship, that's a beautiful shift that can happen is, we can explore who we are as people in this new way where we're more established professionally. Our lives are hopefully a bit more settled.
And maybe I'm wrong here, but there's also isn't there a link between the perception of masculinity and just sexual activity, performance? If I'm a man, I'm going to be having sex 5 days a week. Otherwise, I'm not a real man. That sort of noise. Presumably, that's not helping. How is that? How do you help men get over that perception? And do you think generally that's becoming less, less of a norm?
Yeah. Well, so again, loving that on this podcast, there's a platform to talk about this because for so long, there wasn't that. And, we get our information from movies, right? Or from things that we think are true or things that maybe other people have said that we believe that maybe are not true. And so, yeah, a big part of the work that I do for men, but also as part of couples, is helping to have those sorts of conversations. Because if we're not talking about it and men think that's what I'm supposed to do, but they're not actually talking to their partner about it, then we're missing some really important information. So I help to build that comfort and that practice for men to be able to talk to their partner about what does their partner want or need or expect. How can the two of us talk to each other so that our sex life is working for both of us and it's not about expectations or pressure. It's actually what feels good. And, what does sex mean as we move into midlife? It can also change. Particularly like we mentioned, porn before, movies, sex equals penetration and it's this amount of time and it's an orgasm and it's all these things. But intimacy in a long-term partnership can look differently. It can include all sorts of sexual activity, not just that kind, but lots of different kinds, depending on what you want and what feels good in that moment. But we need to be able to talk about it. Otherwise, we're just guessing or assuming.
So the work you do with men, let's talk a bit about the things that the tools men can use. I think you talk about a magic ratio, kind of 5-to-1. Can you tell us a bit about that? And how does that help men perhaps unlock problems they've had in their relationships?
Hmm. Yeah, no, I love having a roadmap. I was an athlete all through school, and if I'm trying to achieve something, I need some kind of roadmap or sometimes some kind of tools to get there. And a lot of the therapy space can feel like, oh, well, we're talking about our feelings, but what are we actually doing? And so this 5-to-1 magic ratio that I found from John and Julie Gottman's research, I was so happy to see because it gave me like, okay, this is what I do and it works. And so the idea there is in a relationship, we need at least 5 positive, complementary connection points for every one of disagreement or criticism or like negative feeling or feedback. And so let's look at the course of a typical day. In a typical day in the relationship, if I find and tell my partner at least 5 things that I appreciate about them, that I see them doing really well, that I am excited that they're doing, for every one thing that maybe, this is not going well, or hey, I need you to do this differently, then I'm in balance. So it's at least 5 to every one, which often, men will tell me like, that's really hard work. I've got to find, at least 5 things a day. And it's not exactly a checklist, but what was helpful for me there is, there are things that are bothering me all the time because I'm a human, right? There's going to be things that upset me. But if I want my partner to hear those things and to do something constructively with them, I need to also be noticing and saying out loud all the things that I love and appreciate that are going well with them. And when I've tried this and put it into practice, it really does work. And I'm totally outweighing the relationship with connection moments, with positivity. And then the things that are bothering me or, I need to be different, those are heard instead of turning into an argument or a conflict. Because usually what happens in relationships to people that I work with is there's not enough of that positive noticing, that complimenting, that praising. And then when we are upset about something, it turns into a conflict and it turns into, oh yeah, well, you do this. No, you do that. And now we're battling each other instead of the problem.
Because it's tricky, isn't it? When you have, say, children or a very, intense job, you have very little time to yourself. And so what do? We kind of, take it out on the person that's nearest to us, who's normally our other half. So, how do men, how do you kind of step back and just take a moment and try and do the things you're saying, just really think about 5 things, for example, to say that are positive.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, I kind of laugh when I say this, but it's true. I think about, if there's something that I want, what's the best way for me to get there? And so if the best way for me to have this thing that's bothering me change is, I need to put extra energy and attention into noticing the good things and saying them out loud, I'm going to do that. And it can feel a little like, oh, well, that's just, a formula and it's not intentional. You don't really mean it. It's not authentic. But trust me, because the more you do it, the more authentic it feels. The more you notice the good things happening, the more you feel positive towards the other person. So it feeds on itself. And again, this works. So if men out there are wanting things to change, this is something that I highly recommend trying, even, just for a week. If you find, again, 5 things a day to send a quick message to your partner, tell them you appreciate it, and just see what the results are. It's a snowball rolling downhill. Like you'll see how effective it is and want to keep doing it, and you don't lose anything from it. Again, like you're on the same team as your partner. So by complimenting them, you're not, telling them that they're right and you're wrong. You don't lose any points in the relationship. It just builds connection.
And we talk a lot on this podcast about vulnerability, showing your more vulnerable side, because that's traditionally not something that men do. And as you said earlier, in movies, John Wayne, James Bond, I know they're not necessarily, particularly, contemporary references, but, the idea of being a man is not to show any sort of, your emotions other than anger, actually. So how do you incorporate that vulnerability then into your relationship and combine it with trying to, break down some barriers and, improve those levels of intimacy, for example?
No, I think those are very good examples. I mean, we're talking to men in midlife, and probably won't surprise anybody to hear I've described my dad a little bit. I mean, I was raised watching James Bond movies for sure. I mean, that was an early model for me of what being a man was like. And you have a one night stand, or just an easy casual relationship, and then you go off into your adventure. And sadly, that's what many of the men listening, like, that's not their reality, right? We find ourselves in these long-term partnerships that last longer than, a 2-hour movie, right? Now it's years later, and, how do we connect with each other? And so, yeah, when it comes to vulnerability, what I encourage men to think about is, you don't, there's not an expectation you have to cry. You don't have to be sad or be hurt or expose yourself in that kind of way, at least not right away. Um, but expanding your emotional vocabulary past frustrated, tired, hungry, even just a little bit into connection. So I really love starting with connection as a vulnerability growth move, because you're telling your partner, I want to feel close to you. That's not, you don't have to cry. You don't have to be super upset and vulnerable, but this is your partner who, uh, presumably, right? Like, you've shared a lot of life with, and you're telling them, like, hey, I really want to connect with you later. I want for us to laugh together later. Even that is a way of being vulnerable that maybe we haven't thought to try, because again, like, as men, that's just not a thing that we've really learned how to do and practice. Um, and so, yeah, that's what I encourage starting with is, if you want to do something with your partner that's fun, tell them, hey, I want for us to have fun together later. We haven't done that in a while, and I miss that. That's already, two or three different feelings that you're expressing, and telling them that you miss them is an act of vulnerability.
And you talk about this, and I'm guessing a lot of what you're talking about here is this, the what you call the intimacy shift. And I think that's part of the way that you work with men and with couples. So what's the kind of core idea behind that, the intimacy shift?
hmm Yeah, so it's the name of a program that I run that's 12 weeks. And anybody listening can visit intimacyshift.com. And I have a free 12-page PDF that goes into detail about how to have emotionally intimate conversations with your partner. I use it with all the men that I work with and all the couples, and it's a great tool because, again, it's this framework, this structure. It's not just kind of ooey gooey sharing my feelings. It's actually, this is how we sit down. This is a skill that we can practice. And so the core of that intimacy shift model is wanting to be on the same team as our partner. It's not me versus you. It's the two of us together wanting to feel more close and connected. And that's true emotionally, that's true physically. It's all part of the same set of feelings. And so the very first, tool and skill that I teach there is about setting aside time regularly for you and your partner to talk and work on these skills. Because again, like, wanting to have tools and practices, wanting to get towards our goal, we need to set aside regular time to work on it. Just like learning an instrument or going to the gym to build your muscles, right? Like, in your relationship, we want probably weekly time set aside where we're going to sit down together. And it could be time set aside where we look at the calendar and figure out, like, who's going where this week. I need your help here. You need my help there. And we're building trust. Even just looking at the calendar is a trust building exercise, because you're following up on activities that are important. You may be asking for help or support. But during that conversation, it could also be a time for physical connection. And we're going to work on building our physical intimacy, or having sex, or working towards that kind of closeness. But that's the first step, is setting aside that time.
And then how do you, without going into the whole detail of your PDF, because people can download that, where does, what's the kind of aim then? What's the ultimate aim, when you're kind of at the end of that process using that blueprint?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the ultimate aim is, instead of leaving a conversation feeling hurt or disconnected, or like we argued, or we go our separate ways, that we feel more connected and more close. Because for so many of the people that I work with, we either avoid having these conversations, or when we try to have them, it ends up in an argument. And so some of the tools that I certainly didn't see growing up and had to learn later are things like active listening, how to truly engage in a conversation with the other person so that you're showing them you care, you're taking in all of what they're saying, and then you trade places, and then the other person can hear and take in what you're saying. So skills like reflective listening, validating the other person's thoughts and feelings. And, for some people, maybe they learn these growing up, they come more naturally, but for most of us, and certainly most men, these are things that we need to practice and to work on. So the end goal there is that men are better listeners, better able to express their feelings. And because we've practiced those skills, now we can have a more intimate and close relationship, which I know I want. And I'm sure that all the men listening want that too. We just don't quite know how to get there and haven't known how to practice the skills.
And let me just go back to kind of to the beginning, really. How do you, and I don't mean you, but how, people listening who had the sort of experiences growing up that you did, disconnection with father who perhaps was, provided, I guess, a degree of trauma, really, when you look back on it in terms of your childhood. How do you reconcile those feelings? How do you have a relationship perhaps with your parents when you're an older person, because they're probably going to be elderly by the time you're in your midlife. But how do you reconcile that? Because it's difficult not to hold on to resentment or anger or bitterness.
Oh, that could be a whole other podcast. That work on healing those harms for sure. And so I'll share a little bit, and easier said than done, finding acceptance, right? And a core belief of mine is that everybody is truly doing their best with what they have. And so when you have been harmed by a person, it's not easy to get there, to have that compassion or understanding for the person that has harmed you. But that's the goal, to be able to get to there, because I know, like my dad, for example, like his story growing up, had its own stuff to it. There's a reason that he is who he is. And over time, with a lot of work, I was able to get to the place where I knew holding on to my resentment and anger was not serving me. It was making me a more angry and bitter person. And so that did take time, and that did take work, but I didn't like that version of me. I wanted for it to be different. And by being able to find some degree of acceptance there, and I've, worked to talk with him about many of these things, and some of it he was able to talk about, some of it he wasn't. But on my end, I know that I had done my part to find the acceptance that I needed, and that by being a different version of myself, that was the best way for me to move forward, to have relationships with people that were different. And so, again, not a perfect person. I've been divorced. I have certainly made choices in my life that have caused harm. But I am actively and have been actively working on these things for many years. And so both with my co-parent now, my ex-wife, that relationship is on pretty solid ground right now, different from how my parents were when they split up. And as a father, the way I am for my kids, there's a lot of healing there and doing my work to be different than the way I was treated in different ways. And so that's very much a way to work through some of those hurts and harms that people listening may have had with their families or their parents.
And I guess, there's a point here that, people aren't alone in the way they feel or their experiences, because that's one of the things we try and dispel in this podcast is, if you're just suffering in silence and you don't talk to anyone, then, you don't realize that actually you're not unique. Sorry, you're not unique, but actually this is quite common. And therefore, there are lots of other people who've experienced this and move forward, I guess. So just kind of close out then. This has been really fascinating. So someone listening to this podcast and recognizes themselves, maybe they feel disconnected from their partner, from themselves. What do you want them to know? What's the kind of key message you can give them?
Okay. So 2 parts. You covered the first part. They are not alone. So that is huge. Because when we feel alone, we are not going to talk about it and don't know where to begin or where to change. So you are not alone. You've heard me share stories from my life, and many of the things I've shared are common with people that I have worked with. So that's the first part. And then the second part is, really having agency and empowerment that you do have a choice, right? There's not a default setting where you're wired differently than everybody else and you can't do some of these things. So we do have a choice that we can move towards connection or towards disconnection. And so a lot of the things I've shared today are how we move towards connection. What is a thing that I can try to do? Is it telling my partner that I, miss them and want to spend time and feel close to them? Saying that out loud is a move towards connection. And that's, one way. There are others, but we always have that opportunity to make a choice to move towards connection. And I encourage, everybody listening to think about that and to put that into practice in some kind of way in their life.
Thank you, Dan. That's been brilliant. Thanks for joining us today. And if people want to get in contact or find out more, we'll put the link to your website in the show notes. Perhaps you just want to reiterate the name of the website.
Absolutely. Yeah. intimacyshift.com. Best way to connect with me. And you'll get, like I mentioned, that free PDF guide that has tools, actionable insights, right away. And yeah, I hope people do. I love this conversation. So important and would be more than happy to connect with your audience.
You want to find out more about Dan's work? Visit his website, either intimacyshift.com or growthandgratitudetherapy.com. Here you can also download the free guide Dan references in our conversation, and we'll include all these links in the show notes. To help raise the profile of the podcast, as ever, it really helps if you can please review the show, and please also share it with your networks. Finally, if you have a story to share, then do contact me through the website mid-lifemen.com.